Title of this strategic planning session is The Transatlantic Bridge. The Transatlantic Bridge, and what I intend by that is the transition from us being a presbytery within the FCC in Scotland, the transition from that across the Atlantic to the Free Church actually establishing an independent and indigenous denomination here within the confines of the United States. So that's the concept, this bridge from Scotland to the planting of a church here in the U.S. And let me begin with a little analogy. So bridges consist primarily of three sections. You have, first of all, the superstructure, if you will. So you have the superstructure. That would include the abutment on either end. It would include the deck across which we drive. Some bridges, it would include the arches and ties and so on. But that superstructure is what we see. That's what we often think of when we think of a bridge, the stuff we see driving across the deck from one side to another over a body of water or whatever. Underneath that, you have the substructure of the bridge. And this is partly seen and partly not seen if it's over water, especially. And it would include all sorts of things as well, but it would include the piers and the pier caps and so on. Bridges over water, some of that is hidden under the water. And then, of course, underneath the substructure, we have the foundation, right? The piles that are deeply embedded into the bedrock underneath. So if you'll bear with me for just a second with regards to this analogy. So applying it to this transatlantic bridge, the foundation, first of all, that most basic fundamental layer, the foundation for this transition is, of course, the Word of God. So nothing else. That is what undergirds everything. That is what provides support to uphold the weight of all that we are seeking to do. We also have the superstructure, that part that's on top, the part you see and drive on. And initially, when I chose this title and theme, I intended to actually, in the strategic planning, to take up the nuts and bolts, right, of kind of addressing some of the practical and procedural steps that will be necessary for the formation of an indigenous U.S. denomination. That was my original intention. And that would have to do with all the kinds of things that you see, structures, courts, constitutional issues, how we're going to work out the practicalities of the relationship of presbyteries, general assemblies, so on and so forth, right? That's the thing. Those are the things that we see. However, Presbytery, as you know, has erected a committee to devote themselves exclusively to this and to bring back reports at each meeting of Presbytery. And what they're going to do will be of far greater substantial help than a single address or a single strategic planning. So instead, what I want to do over the next few minutes is to actually address, by way of analogy, what I described as the substructure. So it's the part in the middle, not the part on top that you see, all the moving parts, the nuts and bolts, obviously not the foundation, which is dealing with the scripture itself, but the middle part. And I believe this is where, indeed, the Lord would have us to focus our attention this morning. And this pertains to giving our attention to elements in this transition from being a part of the church in Scotland to having our own in the U.S., elements related to the spiritual dimensions of that transition, some of which we see and a lot of which we don't see, dealing with things in our own hearts and souls. So we're thinking in terms of that category, things that are seen and not seen, but the kind of practical, spiritual preparation that's needed for this to be brought to pass. And this is important, I believe, because times of transition are times of vulnerability. I mean, this is almost universally true in life, in all sorts of contexts and circumstances. Important because times of transition are times of vulnerability. And we are most vulnerable when we are most unaware of the lurking dangers, which is why God calls us to watchfulness. And so we should be expecting in this whole undertaking, this bridge, we should be expecting that there are going to be attacks from Satan. We should be expecting that there's going to be a flare of sinful hearts, and that there's going to be potentially the sowing of seeds of disintegration from the beginning. And all the more, of course, because the devil knows history better than you and I do. And he's watched over the unfolding annals of history what happens and the planting of denominations and, the commitment to apostolic and biblical Christian doctrine and practice and piety and outreach and so on. And thus he has a very keen interest and makes a concerted effort to undermine these things. And so the aim of the address is to focus on the substructure, some of the spiritual aspects of this transition. I want to do it under three things, and then I'm going to pitch it to you to flesh some of this out. But three things that I think, three components that we need to be keeping our eye on. The first is humility. So the first is humility. One thing essential for this transatlantic bridge is the reality and the exercise of humility, top to bottom, inside and out, beginning to end. And when I say humility, I don't mean looking humble. We can all learn the language of piety. And in our circles, we're surrounded by it. It's the atmosphere that we breathe. It's very easy to put on an air of humility. But what I'm talking about is real, spirit-wrought, gospel humility, where we're humbling ourselves, truly humble before the Lord, in secret, where no one else is looking, right? To use Paul's language, lowliness of mind, so that in our minds, there's a true lowliness. Why is this important? Well, take a leaf from our own history. 1843 happens, we have the Great Disruption. And at the time, it's rising out of a decade of spirit-wrought revival, and there's all sorts of wonderful things. But you look at it, it was a time in which fasting was called for, a time of concerted corporate and private prayer. There was great cost, right? They lost all their manses. They lost all of their churches. They were stripped of all of their ministerial stipends. They lost all the privileges that came with the establishment. They were reduced, as it were, to the dustbin. There was no triumphalism among them. And yet, within a few decades, how things changed. The Lord poured out his blessing by the Spirit, raised it up to be the most powerful force in Britain, for sure. Many would say within Europe as a whole. A bright light. Thousands of churches filled with thousands of people. Missionaries sent to the four corners of the earth, and so on and so forth. And there was a change. And they began to feel as if they were something. They had arrived. They were noticed. And then there became a desire, perhaps, I think from the beginning, this earnest desire to be recognized not only in the nation, but within and among the Europe and even across the pond as well. This desire to, having been stripped of everything, to finally have arrived. And they began, in their pride, to compromise. And it led to a downgrade, as you all know, and I don't need to go over that ground with you. But brothers, we need to be clear in our own heads. First of all, we are nothing. We need to be persuaded to the depth of our being that is absolutely true. You and I and we together are nothing. We are a group of nobodies. But you know what? We like it that way. We like it that way. Because really, all we want is for Christ to be everything. That's what we want, is for him to be everything. And so we do, and I pray will, jettison self-promotion. Self-promotion that hides under the guise of a crusade to win and draw a following. I pray that we'll jettison that, because our only goal is to draw followers to Christ. That's our desire. It may be hard to believe, but in 3 generations, we won't be remembered. It only takes 3 generations. How much do you know about your great-grandfather, grandmother? You know, or the minister, you know, at that same period in the church that you grew up in, and so on and so forth. In 3 generations, we won't be remembered. Our names will only appear in the record of minutes on a siderin and will mean nothing to those who read them. But brothers, you won't care in heaven, where only his name matters. You won't care. You say, well, what is the goal? What is the goal in all of this? That as a result of our forgotten labors, a solid church will remain. Our names won't remain. But pray to God that by the blessing of the Lord Jesus Christ, a solid church will remain for the spread of Christ's name in the advance of his kingdom. Right? We heard yesterday, fix your gaze on the last day, because though no one else will remember, Christ will remember, and he will richly reward all that is done for his name. And on that last day, neither you nor the whole world will give 2 hoots about how you were perceived here on earth, because Christ's assessment at that moment will preclude all others. And those who sowed and those who reaped will rejoice together. We need humility, the real gospel humility, to recognize we're not great, we're not phenomenal, we're not, indisposable, we're not anything of the like. And we need to understand that as a body, we need men of piety. We need men of uncompromising conviction more than we need men of gifts and popularity. We thank God for gifts. And gifts are a part of what the Lord has prescribed. But we need most of all in our hearts and heads, we need most of all men of piety. I mean, you think in that period I was describing within the Free Church, William Robertson Smith. I mean, for those of you who are in the Free Church, that name you know well, right? You have this prodigious youth, this phenomenal, precocious youth, this phenomenally gifted guy who grows up within a very solid church and who created complete wreckage as a consequence. Gifts and popularity are not the thing that attract our notice, though we're thankful when we have them. It's men of piety, humility, uncompromising conviction. This humility includes teachability among one another, to be eager to hear from our brethren, to be teachable. Young men, take counsel with regards to this, because one thing I was taught when I was a young man, and I've sought to do and still do, is to quiz older ministers every opportunity I get. I have in my head a catalog of all the conversations of those that I have spoken to, right? To sit ministers older than me down and to say, tell me, how do you see things now? What do you wish you knew now? What do you wish you had known when you're at my stage? What were the things you learned? Because secondhand experience is the cheapest. We should get all of it that we can in order to gain wisdom. That's humility. We need to learn from others. We need to steer clear. I mean steer clear of those who won't take counsel or who won't hear criticism right? Myopia, physically, uncorrected in our eyes, leads to self-destructive consequences. And so does spiritual myopia. We don't hitch our wagon to a truck that's heading for a cliff. There are countless examples of this. But you and I need to be those who can hear, those who are trustworthy. This humility is all the more important when there is any whiff or wind of popularity. You go through those early seasons, and as a presbytery, it's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and little to show for it. And the Lord begins to fill the sails with wind, and there's momentum, and there's growth, and there's impact, and that attracts notice, and that becomes popular. There's some draw, and that popularity can become intoxicating, but it is a spiritual poison to us. Right? It always comes under the guise, of course, that we could do good. We could do so much more good if we seek after the lust of more popularity. But in fact, it ends up unwinding us. And either the trust that the Lord has given to us is downplayed or abandoned altogether. Popularity becomes a diversion. My brothers, I would say, studiously ignore it. We're thankful for the advance of the kingdom of Jesus Christ, the planting of churches, people being added to churches, the impact of preaching, online presence, all that's fine. But in terms of the response to any of that, the response of popularity, studiously ignore it. Keep your head down, low before the Lord, your nose to the grindstone, and continue to serve in all of the ways that God has called you to, without sipping from that intoxicating drink. Don't court it. Don't play with it. The fact is that both those who are broad and compromising and those on the other end who are radical, both of them court novelty. Right? Trends are flighty. I'll say more about this in a second. Stay off of the wagon. And so we need to remember who we are. Right? We need to remember that we are nothing before the Lord. That's not pious language. That is literally the case with us. We need to remember who we are in terms of plain Jane, plain vanilla, Presbyterian, Scottish Presbyterian believers. We need to be focusing on what God has always called us to focus on, and not be diverted to other things. But this humility, one last thing on humility, also puts, I think, to the fore the priority of the place of prayer. So prayer is an expression of humility, right? We know this in our own Christian experience. The private place is the place of power. Our time with the Lord himself, meditating on Scripture for our own soul, keeping our heart, asking ourselves the hard questions. Lord, is it I? But the priority of prayer needs to be so deeply woven into who we are that it becomes nigh impossible to remove it. We all know this crowd, I don't need to say, Acts 6, verse 4, the apostles gave themselves to prayer and to the ministry of the word. It cheers my heart to see that throughout presbytery meetings, we are constantly praying. Up and down, up and down, up and down, the whole afternoon. We come to items on the agenda, we deal with them, let's seek the Lord and pray. Next item, let's seek the Lord and pray. May God make it so forever with us. Our prayer meetings, our times of informal prayer, our occasions as elders and ministers and so on, where we get together to pray. Oh, that it would be said of us, these people are always praying. When they think of us, those from outside would say, these people are always praying. They will wear you out. They'll exhaust you with prayer. May it be so for us, brothers. It's an expression of humility. I need to move on. Secondly, fidelity. So we have humility. This bridge requires underneath it genuine humility. But then secondly, fidelity, right? Tenacious grasp of the truth. If you want a denomination that lasts, it must be rooted in what is timeless. Right? There has to be a tenacious commitment to our testimony. Because modernity builds quickly, decays quickly. I mean, we see it in buildings. Antiquity was different that way. I mean, they built carefully. And their stuff decayed more slowly, and so on. We need to hold fast to the testimony the Lord's given to us. There will be undoubtedly, and perhaps soon, a push for open discussions. We need to have open discussions about this and that and the other thing. Things that we've already resolved, things that we've already decided, things that the Lord's already shown us and convinced us of and convicted us of, and so on and so forth. Those calls for open discussions on truths that are already settled are a waste of time. We've settled who we are and what we believe, and we need to get on with it. Right? The erosion of constitutional commitments. It means being good gatekeepers. That the longing to grow is not done at the expense of dishonoring our head. Right? Growth, I said, attracts people. Unlike when you're little and struggling and covered in sweat and blood. But just because someone's attracted doesn't mean they actually fit or meet the criteria or are qualified. We need to be good gatekeepers. They may say, well, I'm against all these things that we're also against. That doesn't mean that we're for the same things. They may say, I hold all these principles with being utterly clueless on the core of who we are. I believe in the establishment principle, purity of worship, and I believe in, the biblical, view on the relationship of the confession and the church, and so on and so forth. But you've never preached an experimental sermon in your life. That's a problem for us. We have to be good gatekeepers. I mean, this fidelity is also an element of humility, isn't it? Because we can't give up one thread of truth that the Lord's given to us. Why can't we give up one thread of truth? Because it's not ours to give. It's Christ's truth. We don't have the power to give what is his. I had a long talk recently with Pastor Ellis, who's not here. While he's still with us, he's in his 80s. Tom, take me back to the very beginning. Take me all the way back to when you were a childhood. I need to hear it all. I've had a series of talks with him about the Southern Church, which we love. We love Dabney and Thornwell and Peck and all the, the Palmer and so on and so forth from the 19th century. What happened? I can read about it in the books, but you were there. And you went to seminary at Columbia, and you knew the names and men and the preachers, and you heard them and the professors. Quizzed him to death on these sorts of things. It's important for us, right? We need fidelity. As you heard passing reference to in the previous address, don't remove the old landmarks. And for those of you who are young men here, you should be giving this same kind of talk 30 or 40 years from now. The one you're hearing right now, I hope you'll be given when some of us are long gone. It's true for our people. We need our people to read old books, not because we're antiquarian or old-fashioned, but because those old books are timeless. It gives you discernment to see more clearly present issues from outside. Right? I've seen this over and over again in my own ministry. Right? God's truths transcend contemporary controversies. And so you look at some of the classics that you have in your library, Reformed classics, and then you can compare that to some other books that you pick up, old books even. And you open it up, and it's all unfamiliar names, unfamiliar events, unfamiliar issues. They're referring to people we don't know anymore, and details about discussions that we don't know anymore. No one reads those books. And if you find them at a used bookstore, no one's going to reprint them because they were so bound to their context. If you're consumed with all of the present debates, you have wasted, in a colossal way, your very limited time. The big thing is never the big thing that we're being presented with. Your brain gets hijacked. Instead, we need to learn to ignore some of those things. You don't need to weigh in on everything. The fact is, and I feel, I haven't said this to anyone, but it would be appropriate, that, you are shallow because you swim in the shallows. It's true, far too many. Men are bogged down in all of these things, which are forgotten in 10 years. I think back, I didn't realize until yesterday, I went to seminary 30 years ago, this year. And I think back to all the hot topics and debates and stuff we were all animated about and so on and so forth. No one thinks about any of that anymore. Right? It was completely irrelevant. And all that I've seen come and go over that same period. The point is this: while others are bogged down in this thing and that thing, flash in the pan after flash in the pan, we should be moving forward and building a sound foundation that will outlast all that stuff that will be forgotten. Other churches actually build on the buzz because the buzz generates lots of press and energy. And so they attract all sorts of people, and the fads and the trends and what's in vogue and what's edgy. These things are attractive to people, but they also burn out quickly, and they won't be around long. Some of these churches where you see the groundswell of growth based on the buzz, your kids will be looking for them. They'll never even heard of the churches because they'll have long since been gone by the time they reach their older years. Those who build their identity on what they're against. You'll understand what I mean when I say this. We build on what is boring, what others can wrongly consider boring. Solidity, stability. It's true. Some of the trends out there touch our identity. They do. But we don't ride the wave. We don't get on the bandwagon. I think, there's a point where it's like, you need to have your children in church. Well, we do that. But it became a thing and a movement. Everybody's talking about. Well, we didn't join the movement. We just kept being who we are without trying to ride that wave. I think of open air preaching. There was a 2-year window when, was it 8 years ago or so, it became the cool thing. And I had calls, call, we want to interview you, and you're going to do this, that, and the other thing, and blah, blah, blah. We would go to Fall to Greenville in the Fall for Greenville thing, and previous years, I'd be the only guy out there preaching at the festival. And then for 2 years, we had like 15 street preachers coming from other states, up and down Main Street and so on. And there's this big movement. Those 2 years passed, back to empty again. Nothing. Nobody's out there preaching. During the week at Fall for Greenville, relatively little impact. The point is, we don't get on the bandwagon and ride the wave. We are who we are because we love the Lord Jesus Christ and have been persuaded by his word. And we can be that without the merry-go-round and elevating things as our main identity in order to gain attraction. You need to learn to yawn. Not fake yawn. Not condescending yawn. A genuine yawn. To be bored to tears with what exhilarates other people. Why? Because you are exhilarated by the good things, the choice things, the great things that the Lord has given to you. Yes, there is a time to engage. But if we're listening, if we're thinking about anything I'm saying here, when we do, it is from a far deeper and more grounded position. Because we haven't been swept up with all the fanfare. Some speak into what everyone else is talking about. For some, the motive is to be relevant, and so they compromise and adopt the world. For others, the motive is to be faithful, and so they're speaking into all of those things in reaction to the world. But I would propose that in both cases, it is a diversion. Why? Because in both of these cases, they are taking their cue from the world. Someone else is controlling the discussion. Someone else is determining the questions. Someone else is the one that is deciding what the important things are. It's a diversion. We derive answers to those questions from this book, not from what the world's screaming about and we feel like we need to talk about. The point is, opposite responses, one's wanting to be relevant, one's wanting to be faithful, but the result is that they both become ultimately irrelevant and unfaithful to God's task. We don't need an identity crisis about who we are as a presbytery. We are those who always have been and always will be much in the main things. We excel at the bread and butter. So there's tenacity. There's this fidelity to the truth, to our doctrinal commitments. That means both defending against the loosening of our grip on those truths, so giving up things that we've pledged ourselves to keep. But it also means, as I've tried to make clear, not being diverted from the task that the Lord's given us and focusing on other things. Thirdly, charity. Humility, fidelity, charity. Charity inside the church breeds unity. Charity shown to those outside the church breeds a Reformed Catholicity. Brothers, we need to learn to esteem others higher than ourselves. That means each other. I need to be able to look into the face of my fellow ministers and elders and think, man, to esteem them inside in all of the ways in which I see Christ in them and maturity and things that I need to be and become and learn, and to love them for that. We need to be able to see that for those outside of our churches as well. Because pride fractures unity. We said humility, fidelity, charity. But without that humility, you're going to end up with a fracturing of unity. Isn't this what Solomon says? Cast out the proud man, and contention will cease. Contention, this brewing. As a minister, you should know this already. There's a bunch of contention going on in the congregation. It should be easy. Well, okay, where's the pride? The Lord says we remove that, the contention's going to cease. But this happens in very, very subtle ways. There can be a suspicion of our brothers rather than esteem of our brothers. Well, I don't agree with him on that point. I don't like the way he does that. I think there's, different emphasis in this thing or that thing. And we begin to nurse it, to cultivate a little bit of distance or suspicion about them. There can be comparing ourselves among ourselves, which Paul forbids to the Corinthians, and thinking, well, kind of what's really important are the areas I'm strong in. Of course, those are the most important things. And the things I'm weak in, well, those aren't as important. And then we begin to look at our brothers, and they're weak in places we're strong, and we think, well, this is terrible. This is catastrophic for the church because they're weak in these things. Folly, folly, folly. To be comparing ourselves among ourselves. Having diversity without factionalism. Right? In a recognition that there's going to be a variety of gifts. We're going to have differences among each other on extra confessional issues. Differences in terms of exegesis of certain passages. And being able to have all of that sort of diversity without it becoming a rank factionalism. To have an unbudgeable tenacity without an insularity. Without being inside ourselves. Right? What happens with growth? The potential for a party spirit. You're a band of brothers at the beginning, and it's a small group, and we're all in the yoke, and we're, fighting together, and it grows. And now there's a lot more people, and it becomes easy for a party spirit to begin to develop disunity, pulling and steering away from each other. Humility helps here too, right? Openness, being able to be frank and open and to trust, cultivate trust with one another. A willingness to hear what my brethren have to say to me, and a willingness to speak to my brethren what they need to hear from me. Trust and openness. It means building an ethos. What does it mean to be Free Church? Our identity, who we are. Having genuine glue. The people in our pews, as well as the officers in our body, ministers, elders, deacons, and so on, there should be a glue, and there should be an identity, and there should be an ethos without an edge, without an exclusiveness, while maintaining a Catholicity of spirit. You think in terms of your home. At my home, we do certain things certain ways. But then there are people that we're super close to and love dearly, and in the congregation, whatever, in their home, they do certain things certain ways that are different than ours. And when we're home, this is how we're doing it. But that does not mean that when we look at other brethren in other homes, that there's a sense of pride or a sense of angst or a sense of, well, they're terrible because they don't do it like we do. No, we teach our children, what it means to operate within those confines, to be able to maintain our family's identity with an openness and love and acceptance and appreciation for those who might do things differently than we do, matters that are non-essential. Right? There has to be something of that in our relationship to others. We all slip here. I have slipped here so many times. I've banged my head over and over and over again. We begin to think we're right and they're wrong. We're right and that church is wrong. That church is wrong. We're right. It's not a good way to think. God is right and they are wrong. That's okay. God is right in His Word. And on these particular areas, others are wrong. So we are too in other areas. But the point is, it's not about us. That's the point. It's about Him. And there's no credit to us for merely pointing to the book. Right? It's His truth, not ours. And so we need to cultivate our own ethos and loyalty, know that we're different, know why we're different, who we are, without this sort of us versus them mentality. Strengthening our identity without nursing our own pride. To be passionate about who we are because we're passionate about looking up to who the Lord is. We're looking up to Him. There's a difference between looking up to Him and looking over at others. We're passionate about who we are and what God's taught us because we're looking up to Him, not because we're looking over our shoulder at other people. That also helps us, by the way, prevent the opposite error, doesn't it? Which is to become like them in ways that are sinful or inappropriate. If we're looking up rather than over, we won't become like them either in ways that we shouldn't. And so this whole business of charity, my point is this, brothers, and I'm going to quit here actually, because I've gone longer than I ever intended. My point is this, as a student of history myself and a student of historical theology, one thing that I've taken with me over the years as I've investigated various things is this concept: seeds of disintegration. You see the unfolding and this devastating stuff that happens in history. I look at it and I say, I'm really, really interested to find out where were the seeds of disintegration. To trace back and under the layers and looking behind the doors and to get to where was it that these seeds of disintegration were introduced, coming to fruition later. So my point in this little talk is that at a time of new beginnings, a time of transition, this transatlantic bridge, are times in which those seeds of disintegration can be sown. Unseen initially, but a few decades from now, wreaking havoc and bearing fruit, with posterity perhaps coming to see what we failed to see in the present hour. I want us to think along those lines. I want us to think not just about the nuts and bolts, but spiritually getting our hearts in the fear of God low before the Lord, in love with Him, getting those things in place as part of this transatlantic bridge.